Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth from Fox News, who was interviewed just a few days ago, actually a few days before all this came in, with some very illuminating things. And I want to look at some of those comments that he made there. Some are hopeful, some are positive, and some less so. We'll take a look at it. First of all, he was asked, are you worried about nuclear war?
Are you concerned about nuclear war?
I mean, yes, in a general sense, I guess. I found overinflated from the beginning this idea that Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine was going to lead to nuclear war or war across the continent. I've always felt like it was, from the beginning, like a couple days in, I was like, this feels like a Putin's give me my shit back war. It kind of feels like, I feel like you've been pushing pretty hard, and we used to have the former Soviet Union, and we were pretty proud of that. And Ukraine was a part of it, and all these other countries, and I want my shit back. And I think I'm at the right time where I'm powerful enough to do it, and you're not quite on my border yet, and Biden's AWOL, so I'm going for it. And just like I did under my minor incursion under Obama, I got what I could, I got Crimea, now I waited under Trump, now I'm gonna get my, and this idea that I hear all the time, and I've friends who would probably agree with us on most things. They're like, well, if you don't stop him in Ukraine, then he's going to go all the way to Poland. And he's going, I don't think he's, I mean, maybe in a perfect world where he had unlimited capabilities and he could crown himself king of Europe, he would. I think he's probably knows enough to know that it's probably not going much further than Ukraine.
Now, a couple of things really jumped out at there. Me, the first one was alarming, where he said, "Yeah, I'm kind of worried about nuclear war." How does that make you? How does that strike you that the Secretary of Defense nominee is only sort of worried about nuclear war?
Well, admittedly, the entire discussion was not terribly nuanced or informed, and certainly not by any means sophisticated. So, the only thing I can say is that his views are sadly not very different from most congressmen on the Hill and from a lot of senators. None of these people have very sophisticated views of events overseas, and particularly of Russia or Iran or Turkey or China or any of these places. Most of them never been there, and if they were there, they were tourists, flew in, flew out. So I'm not really surprised, Dan. And remember, as we've talked so often, Americans have lost their very reasonable fear of war. You know, as we've talked before, when I was growing up, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember what people did, how people felt, and their concerns. And obviously, President Kennedy was extremely concerned and alarmed by the statements of people made that, like Curtis LeMay and the chief of naval operations at the time, because he absolutely was horrified at the prospect of any kind of nuclear exchange, knowing full well the poisonous impact of such a thing. So, you know, he represents, I think, Pete Hegseth, who is a very nice guy and gives a good rousing speech in support of Trump when he was on the campaign trail, is just expressing views in a way that I think is not very different from a lot of Americans.
And let's look at the second part of that there, where he was talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, in that at least he doesn't seem to be going any, like the Biden administration, who are going to be there forever. We're going to help them. And, otherwise they're coming for us. And so do you get any optimism from his view there?
Well, I think he reflects the attitude that's developing, that we've wasted enough money on this enterprise. He says, well, I don't think he'll go much beyond Ukraine. That's fine. And he's not going to go much beyond the Dnieper River unless, we compel it. So that's fine. But this, again, is blowing with the wind in Washington. The wind has changed in Washington. The money is drying up. No one wants to stand up and say what a catastrophic error this was and admit the folly. So everybody sort of says, well, that's enough. We've done all we can. And they walk away. We did that after Vietnam. Very little accountability is involved. It doesn't give me much hope for any sort of rational approach in the future, Dan. I mean, come on, let's face it. It's easy to say now, well, I guess that's not going to work. But thanks very much. I mean, look at the legions of people who are saying, well, I guess Ukraine can't win. And just 6 weeks ago, they were hard over. And he wasn't any different. Let's give more strike weapons to the Ukrainians so they can do more damage to the Russians. That was something from Waltz when he was in Congress just a few weeks ago. Now he's changed his tune. It doesn't give me any confidence that we have anybody thinking entering these offices at the moment.
In that same interview there, Hegseth was talking about how he views China and how some of the Pentagon's own war computer simulations have not turned out well. Now, he's going to say something here on the one hand that seems pretty self-evident. I think you and I have talked about this before, but then it's where he goes after that that raises a little eyebrows.
In the past X number of years, 10, 12, 15, the Pentagon has a perfect record in all of its war games against China. We lose every time inside the Pentagon war games. We know what our real capability. You see, we didn't even get to this part of the war on warriors. I mean, the military-industrial complex, the way we procure weapon systems. We're always the way our system works, the way our bureaucratic system works, where the speed of weapons procurement works. We're always a decade behind in fighting the last war, whereas China, we have what did Rumsfeld say? You go to the war, the army you have. We have the army. China's building an army specifically dedicated to defeating the United States of America. That is their strategic outset. Take hypersonic missiles. So if our whole power projection platform is aircraft carriers and the ability to project power that way strategically around the globe, and yeah, we have a nuclear triad and all of that, but a big part of it. And if 15 hypersonic missiles can take out our 10 aircraft carriers in the first 20 minutes of a conflict, what does that look like?
Now, you have been talking about the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier and how it's like the battleship of the age old that we haven't recognized yet. So you probably would agree with that part there. And certainly, I've talked about the imbalance in that part of the world. If we went over to fight China on their terms, in their front door over the issue of Taiwan, they have all the operational advantages. But if he's right on that, then that would portend a significant change of policy, especially if he's going to lead the Pentagon to where we have to have very different policies regarding China, and they can't continue to be hostile and pushing. How do you view that?
In January 1997, when Breaking the Phalanx was published, I had a whole chapter on a war in CENTCOM, and I compared the Navy's position to that of our ships off the coast of Okinawa during World War II. In fact, my father was serving on one of those vessels and sat under the hail of kamikazes that flew in. The kamikazes sunk something like 9 ships, damaged another 26 or 27. It was a very frightening experience. And my point was, what you saw with the kamikazes, make it, you sort of cube it and then make it much more lethal. And large numbers of shore batteries consisting of cruise missiles and unmanned, what a cruise missile is essentially an unmanned attack system. They'll sink most of these amphibious ships and other kinds of vessels and changing warfare. Well, that was in 97. Of course, I was pilloried and the Navy renounced me because I was arguing for no more aircraft carriers. Don't build anymore. Let's use these until retirement because they're only useful as in a permissive environment. That's true, but he's saying that now, and of course, more and more people have come on board with this idea. I think Andy Krepanevich had the idea of an arsenal ship, which wasn't all that bad. It looked something like the Monitor from the Civil War, and just carried lots and lots of missiles that it could launch. But the truth of the matter is, submarines rule the waves, and our preeminent priority strategically should be the building of additional submarines and the maintenance of that fleet. Certainly the maintenance of the human capital. That goes into another discussion.
Yeah.
That's important. I don't think he knows anything. I think he's mouthing things. That goes on in Washington a lot. Most people in Washington have a cocktail level of familiarity with anything. And you go to the cocktail party and you pick up on what's the theme. And so targeting aircraft carriers, that's an easy theme right now. People point to that sort of thing. The thing he doesn't understand is that guess who's building aircraft carriers? The Chinese.
Yeah.
Now, why are they building aircraft carriers? Are they building it because they want to attack us? No, because that's seen as a metric of your greatness as a great power, just as battleships in the 1930s were viewed in the same way. Adolf Hitler wasted precious time and resources on battleships, the Bismarck, the Gneisenau, and they were great ships, but they were no longer necessary.
Yeah.
Had he plowed all of that into submarines, he could have begun the war with more submarines. He had something like 29 operational submarines when the war broke out. And people have run those war games and said that if Adolf Hitler had had 50 plus submarines at the beginning of the war, he'd have won. He'd have sunk everything.
Wow.
That's the war game that he should be interested in paying attention to. That's the lesson of the Second World War. And Nimitz said as much at the end of the war. He said none of us appreciated the lethality and importance of the submarine. And Nimitz had commanded a submarine. So that's nice, Pete. Great. That's not part of a larger strategy. There is no new strategy. If there's no new strategy, you can't get a new structure. If you don't have a new structure, you're not going to get new people. You're just putting one or two people here or there that you think are going to lead somewhere new. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to go down the list of, because what's at least supposed to be what's written out is the job description of the Secretary of Defense is supposed to be to set a national security strategy and then to make sure that the force actually supports that strategy and you can actually get it done within the resource constraints that you have, et cetera. And he mentioned in that clip there something that Rumsfeld had said in 2005. He said, well, you get the army that you have when you go to war. Now, you have been publishing all these books since 1997 forward that literally lay out a blueprint for how to go there and how to get a force that can actually meet the next war, not trying to look at what happened in the previous war. What can he do to try and build a force for the future while avoiding war in China?
Well, I'm glad that somebody's finally wakened up and started talking about the folly of war with China, because my point on China from the very beginning has been that there's an old saying in the Navy, a ship's a fool to fight a fort. In other words, if you think your ships offshore are going to demolish a well-fortified site that's ashore with all the equipment and capabilities and weapon systems to fight back, you're wrong. You're going to lose. China is the largest fortress in the history of mankind. And all of their investments in shore batteries and missiles makes it very, very dangerous for us to approach China. And that's the whole point. We talk about this denial strategy that the Chinese have invented, or they haven't really invented it, but adopted. And we keep talking about how we're going to break through this denial strategy and win the war. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. You can't do it. They've got more missiles than we have ships. They have more capabilities to hurl at us than we have ships. But the truth is that with 7 or 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, you could shut down all the commerce that goes in and out of China from the sea. Think about that. So the notion of building more surface ships at this stage for that kind of purpose makes no sense. But that threat is understood by the Chinese. They're working very hard to try and make some breakthroughs in anti-submarine technology. Now, having said all of that, let's get back to strategy. There's no point in attacking China. It doesn't make any sense. Asia is not interested in war. Nobody in Asia wants to go to war. This is the great myth that is perpetrated in Washington to justify out-of-control defense spending. This is where you get people like Elbridge Colby, who for years has been talking about the war with China. He thought he could become Secretary of the Navy and then ultimately preside over some wasteful buildup of the surface fleet to reenact whatever happened in the 1960s or 70s, to realize Admiral Zumwalt's dream of a carrier-based fleet attacking the Russians on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Well, that was fine for Admiral Zumwalt, and he was a brilliant man, but that makes no sense now. So you need a different strategy, and we have to get past assuming certain states are enemies and others are friends. We live in an environment where everyone is a limited liability partner. That means that we share interests with most people most of the time. We want access to the global commons, space, the atmosphere, the oceans, and so forth. That's what's important. And we ought to be interested in that. And we should be interested in avoiding unnecessary conflict because it's destructive. We've lost, what, 14 trillion since 2001 on these crazy wars in the Middle East. And you and I sat in the desert in 1991 when victory was declared, long before anything of real importance had happened. And what was really important? It was the decapitation or removal of the people in Baghdad. Okay, you put in another bunch. You offer control to a new group of generals, invite the UN to come in and hold elections, and you get the hell out. That was something that should have happened in 2003, but we were fighting for different reasons. We were trying to make the entire Middle East, along with much of the world, safe for Israel. It hasn't worked very well. It's made matters much worse for Israel. And that's been obvious to me and to many Israelis since 2003. That's mixing apples and oranges. Well, Afghanistan was irrelevant, but Ukraine is really important. Why? We have no long-term strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. Nobody in Europe does. Everybody in Europe wants to do business with Ukraine and Russia and White Russia. Why? Because of the things they have. That's what the great marriage of Germany to Russia was always all about, a mutually beneficial arrangement, much like the one that exists today between Russia and China. We need to get out of this. We don't fit into it, and it's not in our interest, but we need a new strategy along the lines that I've discussed.
Yeah, indeed we do. And in fact, because you mentioned that about the Middle East also, and how we've been trying to reorganize that or reorder it, and has just been backfired. Here is what Hegseth said regarding the Middle East, and interestingly enough, because he starts off by saying that he's a reformed neocon.
I've been a recovering neocon for 6 years now. Like the foolishness with which we ricocheted around the world, intervening, think it was in our best interest, when really we just overturned the table and created something worse in almost every single scenario, has led to the hubris of the Pentagon is that they want to now tell other countries how to do counterinsurgency based on what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, are you kidding me? So you really have learned nothing. Okay, nothing. So yeah, you're right. The trust there that our political leaders or our generals would have our best interests in mind is totally broken. It's totally broken. I acknowledge that completely. And the last thing I want is my son deploying to the Donbass to defend Eastern Ukraine.
Now, before I get your comment on that, he says he's a recovering neocon from 6 years ago, but here's something that he said regarding the Middle East from 4 years ago.
Sometimes you have moments, Steve, and I happen to believe that we can't kick the can down the road any longer in trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. They used the killing of Soleimani as an excuse to say, we're scrapping the Iran deal. We all know they were scrapping it anyway. So what better time than now to say, we're starting the clock. You've got a week. You've got X amount of time before we start taking out your energy production facilities. We take out key infrastructure. We take out your missile sites. We take out nuclear developments. We take out popular capabilities. Or you know what, take out a Quds headquarters while you're at it if you want. I understand that's not a popular idea.
But I understand, I've been hearing that we believe that the Iranians are hiding missiles and weapons in some of these cultural sites, churches,
of course they do.
Mosques.
This is what Islamists do. Is what they've done on the battlefield against folks like me and my entire generation. Human shields, using mosques, using hospitals, schools. This is what our enemies do. Now, that doesn't mean we go on and target cultural sites, but what it means is we are clear-eyed about how our enemies use the rules that we write against us. And if we want to defeat them, this is something, having seen it, if we want to defeat them, we have to think smart about how these rules, how we navigate within these rules without playing in a game that's rigged to help them so that we can't win. If we're going to fight to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, this regime, then we need to rewrite the rules that are advantageous to us. I don't want to hit cultural sites on purpose, but if you're using one to harbor your most dangerous weapons, then that should be on the target list.
And the president did.
Well, that's we can hope that 4 years ago that was his view, and maybe it's not now. But especially given Trump's proclivity to generally avoid war, how do you see him coming into this one now?
Well, you just listen to the Israeli mantra. That is exactly the argument that they make. And then they go on to insist that their war is our war, that our interests and theirs are identical. It's a dangerous path because most of his comments are taken, if you take them out of context, they don't make much sense. And the context is something that everybody ignores that wants to go to war with Iran. And that's what this is all about. And if you want to benefit from what I would call Israeli largesse, which is really Jewish capital in the diaspora, then you have to sign on for the war with Iran. And that's what he's done. That's what he's about. It's unfortunate because it's very simplistic. You know, I remember people that were cheering that we had killed Soleimani in Iraq. And I pointed out that there were a couple of problems with this. First of all, Soleimani technically was a member of a foreign government. He was the equivalent of the national security advisor to the supreme leader. So it's essentially the same as if someone killed Waltz and then cheered in the streets. Look what we've done. Dumb idea. It was wrong. It was against international law. It was actually against our own laws. Secondly, well, he's responsible for all these American deaths in Iraq. No, he's not. What he did is what we would do if we had an enemy in Mexico. What would we do if there were Russian or Chinese forces in Mexico backing one side against another side in Mexico, and the other side being perhaps a more moderate or liberally minded group versus a group that wanted to not only capture control of Mexico, but then wage war on us? I think we'd have been much tougher on our enemy in Mexico than the Iranians ever were on us in Iraq. You know, you can't isolate these things. He's talking about warfare that is precise and clean and sterile. That doesn't exist. You can't bomb things with impunity. We can't bomb our way out of anything, neither can Netanyahu. This is a dead end. And if we keep it up, we're going to end up at war with a pretty substantial portion, not just of the Middle East, but probably of Asia and Russia. And this is unnecessary. It's counterproductive. It's antithetical to our interests. We're not ready for it. We're not prepared for it.
Now, I can hope that because that comment was made 4 years ago, perhaps he's changed his mind in them, but it's